So what can you tell us about Chelsea Creek and why did we forget it?
Well, I think it was forgotten mainly because we had the Battle of Bunker Hill, which everybody in this region really glommed onto. Certainly, the battles at Lexington and Concord were important, but Bunker Hill really solidified this sort of vision we had of battles in New England, and that's why I think this episode got forgotten.
Okay, yes, Craig.
I just wanted to add that it took place mostly at night too. So whereas the other two battles, Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, took place during the day with thousands of eyewitnesses, this was a relatively dark battle.
Yes.
Not many eyewitnesses, and just the passage of time.
Yeah.
The historical record just disappears.
Yeah. So Chelsea Creek is still there. It's a waterway now between East Boston, Chelsea, Revere, very heavily traveled if you are bringing in natural gas or other things. And these are three kind of interesting industrial areas. And but you have this night battle in May of 1775, and I believe it's the first naval capture of the Revolution.
Naval engagement.
Naval engagement. Okay.
Because it actually was a fight. This was a running engagement. There was a battle going on. Machias, Maine claims to be the first because it captured a vessel, but we're not talking about a battle. It's people. I hate to be so parochial, but it's the people in the district rode up to capture a vessel. We actually captured and destroyed a vessel during combat.
Right. And so the vessel was the Diana, commanded by Lieutenant Thomas Graves, right, who was a nephew of the admiral in charge of the overall operation. Right. And so what brings him up Chelsea Creek to try to, what's he doing in Chelsea Creek?
Well, so I let the historian of the project, Greg, sort of summarize the history, and then I can sort of jump in.
It's an interesting story. He had just arrived in Boston that morning. He was on a coastal assignment down east, and he had just returned. His uncle, Vice Admiral Samuel Graves, was just promoted, and that was the first day that he was going to get to raise his flag as a new Vice Admiral of the Bath or the White. I can't remember which one.
The White.
He had just arrived in town for that. And what sent him up Chelsea Creek was direct orders to pursue the provincials on Model Island, cut off their retreat, and capture or disperse them. He was not at all familiar with the waterway when he was directed to go up there, and he wouldn't have been there otherwise. The Britannia was stationed off of Winnipeg Ferry and was put there specifically to interdict the two waterways on each side, Mystic River on the west and Chelsea Creek on the east. So he was ordered up the waterway to cut off the provincials' retreat.
What are the provincials doing on Noddle's Island, which is today, of course, East Boston?
They were conducting a giant livestock raid. They were sent to get all of the cattle and sheep off of Noddles and Hog Islands and burn all the hay, burn everything they couldn't take off, anything that could be used as a provision for the British Navy and Army in Boston. This was a major victualling station, Noddles was. And so in order to cut off fresh provisions, fresh meat, fresh veggies, and force them to rely on salt beef and preserved salt fish, they had to take the stuff off the Noddles and Hog, and that was what it was a giant livestock raid.
Okay. So someone sees the smoke and realizes that the provincials are up to something on Noddle's Island?
They had actually been tipped off a couple of days before. A spy had relayed the plans to General Gage, so he knew exactly what was coming. He just didn't have the right day. He was a day or two early. The first indication that they had that something was wrong was the smoke coming from the barns on Noddle's Island.
Okay.
It was a surprise.
So these guys are driving the sheep, the cattle, the hogs off of the island, and the sloop Diana comes along shore. And how does this turn in from a livestock raid into an engagement between militia and the British Navy?
Well, Diana's coming upstream, going up the Chelsea River, Chelsea Creek, with an incoming king tide. So it's got a lot of force to push it forward. It's firing on the provincials as it sees them. So they're all on basically its starboard side. It's
Mhm.
to the east of the vessel.
Yeah.
They're going up. They're towing Marines, by the way, behind them, and I think it's 10 to 12 longboats
Hmm.
because they're going to do a landing.
Right.
And so that's really what pushes the battle. It turns from a raid to a battle in that you're now getting forces on both sides firing at each other, and also Marines have landed.
Hmm.
So they're basically coming up. Would be not today Saratoga Street,
Okay.
which was the main path
Right.
to the
Yeah.
ford over the river at Boardman Street. Boardman Street is just north of the creek that divides basically most of East Boston from Orient Heights.
Right. Okay. And so then I understand also they go too far upstream, and that's when the provincials are able to bring heavy artillery to bear. Am I misremembering this?
No, Craig, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. You can explain this part.
No, but at this point, they're sort of nature and and providence in terms of the militia are acting in conjunction. They get to basically, we're not exactly sure whether they reached Sales Creek or not. It's not clear, but they hit a point above Boardman Street today, and it's nice to tie something into current landmarks that really were there, just weren't named. They get above Orient Heights and they run aground, and it's pretty much hard aground. At that point, the militia, the provincials have brought in cannon, and I can't remember. This is where Greg was always best when I'd say, well, which person was this or which house?
3-pounders.
Yeah. But they brought them in at the headwaters of Chelsea Creek at one of the local homes, and they started firing. The Diana started firing back. The Marines were deployed in the longboat and sailors to start towing her off because there was no wind either. And now you have the militia who had been basically on the shores of Orient Heights, Noddle's Island, that part of Riviera, going around the head past Slade's Mill and coming down the eastern shores of Chelsea.
Okay.
Firing on them. So they're basically caught in a cul-de-sac.
Yeah. And tide is running out. And
right.
Yeah. Now, this is all happening at night, too.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And I understand, too, this is the first engagement where we have regiment or men from 3 different provinces all working together.
Yes.
So how does that work?
You did have some New Hampshire men crossing the border during Lexington and Concord, but this was the first official. There was a New Hampshire regiment present on the field working in concert with Massachusetts.
And who was commanding that?
John Stark.
Okay. Yeah. And then the Massachusetts. Excuse me?
1st New Hampshire Regiment under Colonel John Stark.
Okay. And then who were the guys from Connecticut and Massachusetts?
There was a mishmash of Massachusetts regiments. The initial one that started off with Stark, who started the operation with him, was Colonel Nixon. And I don't remember where they were pulled from. But Nixon was an interesting case because 4 of his companies that very morning had mutinied.
Wow.
Why he was chosen to go along on this mission, I don't know. But to make up for those 4 companies that had mutinied, they had drawing detachments of 15, 20 other guys from different regiments. One was Fry's regiment, and the other was Prescott's regiment. Now, I don't remember which one Amos Farnsworth was, but he's the gentleman that left the diary that covers the first half of the battle. He may have been Fry's regiment.
I think so.
He was from Broughton, so I think that's why it was Fry's. Yeah, they were pulling people in, and you had Sprague's company from Chelsea,
right,
59, 60 men there, and there was another smaller detachment that was sort of used as a picket force or a scouting party of 30 men. I don't remember.
But also, I believe Sprague's, most of his militia had been moved out towards Pullen's Point, sort of watching for an anticipated British landing, sort of from the east. Coming in through Revere, and so you don't have like the local Chelsea boys there at the time.
Right.
That you really would have been the best time to have them because they knew the lay of the land.
Right. Okay, so it's unfair of me as an historian to be grilling you guys on the history of the battle since you both are archaeologists. So can you tell us how you two got involved in researching this really interesting story?
In my case, I started off as a, how does one put this in polite society, an anthropologically trained historian, an ethnohistorian. And I realized that in the stuff I was researching was 17th century colonial battles at the time, that archaeology would be of great use. So I already had a history background. So I moved into archaeology to kind of fill up the toolkit, if you will, and give me some extra methods and theories that I could use to do my research. That's how I got into archaeology.
Well, I've been in archaeology in Massachusetts since my undergraduate days at UMass Boston, but in terms of this, I became basically the underwater archaeologist for the state. In the case of Chelsea or Chelsea Creek, that region, my family's from that area, so I had a personal sort of interest in this part of history, which I never heard of growing up. It was sort of like, oh, this is a cool story. Unfortunately, my parents are both dead. I can't share it with them, but it was some way of sort of making a contribution. At the same time, I really like these smaller vignettes of history in archaeology because they build on the broader story. We tend to get caught up in the big picture issues, and these little things really tell why people act or how they act or what really happened. And like Craig, I started out in history and went over to anthropology and then into archaeology. So I had that broader background. And, you and I, Bob, have that maritime history background. So it kind of tied right in. Here's one that picked up on it.
No, you
and
said
it was a first.
Right, yeah. You said it was your second day on the job as the state underwater archaeologist.
Pretty close. It was probably within the first 2 months, but I'd have to go through notes. And unfortunately, that man is now passed on. Mr. Dante Russo, who lived near there, right below Admiral's Hill.
Okay.
And so it was just like a very personal thing to him as well.
And he thought he had found the Diana, Had he?
Yeah.
Have we found the wreckage of the Diana somewhere under the...
No, it's most likely further downstream. I'm going to sort of say between the Tobin Bridge and the Meridian Street Bridge in that general vicinity on the Chelsea side, if it still exists as wreckage. The historic maps we use are just a little bit too recent by maybe 50 years. I think they're from probably the tide. Those maps are probably from the 1810 to 1840 era coastal survey maps.
Right.
And the landing at Chelsea may have moved.
Okay.
So that what they're putting the landing at, which we would see today, is Wynnett Messett Street with the cobblestone still there.
Yeah.
And that landing is probably the mid to late 19th century landing.
Okay.
But they say 60 yards off the ways. So the way's not that far out into the water for a ferry at that time.
Right.
And it would have been a small ferry.
Yeah.
I'm just guessing it's inside the Federal Harbor dredge line. So that shipyard is probably right on top of it.
Right.
And that's where I would search. We have never been able to pull a team together to do the necessary remote sensing. This is not just a diving kind of an adventure. It's going to be a lot of science and technology to really pinpoint it.
Okay. So you guys do diving when you're doing underwater archaeology?
We do, but not on this project. This was strictly an assessment. The problem is, even like with Diana, we just know she's a 100-ton schooner. And the schooner could have been built anywhere from Maryland to Nova Scotia. We just know that Admiralty at the time, after the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, they loved American schooners. And they liked to use them as fast packets, messenger boats, interdiction vessels. So we don't have a lot of data. So we don't know what her draft is. I saw a line come up with a question about the draft of the vessel being only 13 feet. We don't know that. That's speculation. We have not found where she was built. And I've never been able to find anyone that has dug into the admiral's papers, because he certainly was the one who purchased it. Wasn't his nephew.
Yeah. So you guys have written a great art. The one substantive article I know about is one you did in the New England Quarterly back in 2013 on this whole project. But you're trying to find where all of this happened, and it's the episode is forgotten for a long time, except in local lore. And then around the time of the bicentennial, it said it was brought back by some local historians who are interested in it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How it comes back into our consciousness?
Well, I think it's partially that whole bicentennial era when people locally wanted to celebrate their involvement. Revere took the lead, and they got that really good volume out. It really gave us a jump start on research and primary research.
Yeah.
But the other two communities, Chelsea and Revere and East Boston, really didn't pick up on it at that point in time. But as soon as we started this project, we got a lot of local interest. And for me, the anthropologist looking at the Revolutionary War was really excited because what happens is these are all immigrant communities. And granted, you still have original descendants in all of them, but there's such multi-generations of immigrants that really want to own this battle. And for us, it was great because we could show each community had a very important place in the battle. Things happened within their boundaries. The British Marines were stopped in East Boston trying to cross over into Orient Heights. And I still find it amazing that 17 provincial troops basically in creek ditches were able to stop 200 plus British Marines. But we don't know what their orders were. Their orders may have been to go to point X and stop. And then you have the vessel grounding basically in Revere at the head of the creek. And whether it went up Sail Creek, we're not sure. And when you look at the court-martial testimony, it doesn't get into that kind of detail. It's very clean. And so we say all three, I think, are identical. Craig, would you say?
Pretty close. It's an interesting legal history case to look at. It's let's say the eyewitnesses corroborate each other extremely well.
And then she finally goes harder ground and can't be moved at Chelsea, and the troops burn her there after they strip her.
Wow. So they get her off when she's up the creek in what's now Revere. Then she comes back down to off the ferry and then runs aground again.
Right.
And so then how do the sailors get off, those who are aboard the ship?
It will say the hard list. So they can just get off. And basically the longboats are still there. They can bring them out to the fleet. I think Britannia comes in at this point to provide some cover.
Okay.
Britannia, they say that the Britannia comes alongside and helps them pull off before they actually.
What kind of a vessel is Britannia?
It's a brig, wasn't it?
Sloop.
It was a sloop.
Another sloop.
It's just a small sloop. It probably was close in tonnage to the Diana because she stays in service after this point, but it wasn't used. They didn't interdict at all, which is kind of interesting. They sent this one vessel, and the rest of the fleet sits there, including the Britannia, and does no support.
Wow.
The thing with Britannia, though, Britannia was a privateer at this point. Graves bought it after the battle and brought it in to replace the Diana. Sans several crew members. It was a privateer vessel. It was a subcontract.
Wow. So what happens to the vessel then when Diana is sitting there, and the sailors and Marines are off, and then what happens?
They tried to reboard at some point. They were waiting for high tide to refloat the vessel.
Okay.
The British Marines placed an artillery position on West Head, and were still manning that, and they were still shelling the Chelsea Creek, the Chelsea side of the river. So they were trying to keep the provincials off and trying to keep them away from the Diana. It didn't succeed. They did set fire to the Diana. The fire did reach the magazine and exploded. But they had every intention of reboarding her once it was refloated by the tide. Just didn't happen.
So how does each side then react to the loss of this vessel or the destruction of the vessel, depending on which side you're on? What lessons do we get out of this episode?
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, it kind of just peters out. The actual, if you're talking about the Battle of Chelsea Creek, it's not just the Diana. There were subsequent episodes where they came back, the provincials came back to finish the job. They weren't done yet. It was only a 30-man detachment with Amos Farnsworth that had crossed over in the afternoon of the 27th. They had gotten a start on the job. They had burned a barn or maybe two, gotten some livestock off, and killed some horses and set fire to some hay. But there was a lot more to be done. There was the victualling station the Graves had set up there at, what was the gentleman's name?
That's what I'm trying to think of, the
Williams, H.H. Williams?
Williams.
At his house. And he was a provincial quartermaster, actually. So they were
Basically Maverick Station area.
Maverick Station area, exactly. And they had to go back a couple of times to get the job done. And there was some desultory firing back and forth, but it wasn't a battle like we see on the 27th and 28th. As far as the Diana goes, that part of it just kind of peters out. The Britannia brings the wounded into shore at Noddle's Island. There's a main ship captain who's being detained there because they've been caught a possible running around with a ship.
Wow.
He's bringing in some spars. He was actually going to New York. He was coming down from Maine. And he wrote an account that says there was blood running out of the scuppers of the Britannia. So as far as the Navy is concerned, they kind of pulled back and looked at wounds and figured out how to deal with this. Because obviously once you lose a ship in the British Navy, there's a court martial.
Right.
They had to deal with that with the aftermath. So there's not a lot. There's not a lot written about what came next.
Interesting. So then, how did you guys get interested in this? You've spoken a little bit about it, but your project was an archaeological survey. Now, Craig, you're doing your dissertation on something related to this in archaeology. That is, you're not an historian, but there's something you're reconstructing this using. Can you tell us a bit about what this project is?
Yeah, the methodology that I used in my doctoral dissertation is essentially the same methodology that we use in this project. It's called COCOA. It's an anagram that the Army used back in the day for planning operations.
Mm-hmm.
It's a terrain classification system, and it's 5 letters, KOCOA. And it stands for key terrain, observation fields of fire, cover and concealment, obstacles and avenues of approach. And you are taking the terrain as close in time to the battle as you can get, which is what our counterpart Chris Mayo did with his mapping. He was the one with map regression and came up with this beautiful terrain reconstruction that enabled me to apply that method that I had learned from Vic using the historical record to come up with a battle reconstruction. And I took that method and I brought it here to the UK, well, Western Europe, because I went to Spain and did some stuff too. And I found it applicable to undocumented Hellenistic battles of the Roman army. So I've been using it to reconstruct battles here, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So every time I get a spare minute, I get another battle I get to reconstruct. But I've been applying it mostly to Roman conflict in the
Right. Interesting.
And for me, it was really the landscape reconstruction and actually recognizing that for all this, what we think is changed terrain, it really wasn't. And in fact, the creek that runs through the middle of Suffolk Downs is in the same place it was in the colonial period, the same with a lot of the tributaries in the marshland. They haven't been altered. Orient Heights, really, that I always look at the western edge and say, oh, there's a railroad cut. That cut was there. That's a natural cut. The whole terrain, I mean, the manipulation of the landscape is filling.
Yeah.
You know, the eastern shore of Chelsea is filled. They talk about in the narrative of the battle, they had about 3 hours of peace. That's because that was that filled marshland on the Chelsea side.
Yeah.
And then the same thing on the East Boston side, the area below Boardman Street towards the airport. I think it's now hotel space and school and all fields. That's filled tidelands.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I remember you talking about standing on Orient Heights, and then you can see where the creek would have been, where now Ordman
Right.
Street is, where much of this happened. But then so much is still there in this really very heavily urbanized area
Right.
that you can still see where these things took place along these creeks and the marshlands. Now, some of it's been filled in, but some of it is, still there. So, okay, this is a great story, and I'll remind everyone that in the New England Quarterly, September of 2013 issue, we have the great maps showing where this happened, and it's really a terrific model for how to reconstruct a battle. And here you have one we knew very little about, and now, thanks to your work and the work of others, we know more about it. And another piece of this too is that the provincials get this idea of their own ability to do things, and that is something that feeds into what happens at Bunker Hill a month or so later, that they might have an idea of their own ability, which might have been exaggerated from this experience.
Yeah.
Well, but the concepts of like united colonies is laid out here. You have that multi-group working together, whereas before it's very local militia units working together. And the fact of the matter is also people like Stark and Nixon had a broader experience coming in. I mean, they basically are the Rangers of their day. They,
Right.
and 20 years earlier, 10 years earlier, they were really active young military men doing special ops.
Right. Yeah, some of these guys did have a lot of experience from 10 years earlier during the 7 Years' War, and they really bring it to bear here. And, they're all interesting characters. We know less about Nixon than Starr,
Right.
who was a great figure in New Hampshire. But, and so, Craig, we're looking at ancient Rome. Are you doing more with Chelsea Creek? Do you see doing more with the Revolutionary War? I mean, where do you go from here with this, the work you're doing?
I have several projects I'm working on here that are Roman related. There are several sites here in Scotland that show conflict between the indigenous populations and the Roman Empire that do not show up in classical sources. Taking kind of an anthropological approach, knowing how the Roman army fought, the equipment they used, their tactics, their hierarchy, knowing a little bit about what the indigenous population did in the same fashion. I'm using Cocoa to interpret the battlefield assemblages. So whereas at Chelsea Creek we did it pre-excavation, I'm now doing it post-excavation. I'm using that to reconstruct battles. I have maybe 2 or 3 more of those to do. Possibly I'll be hopping over to Spain to do another big one that I can't talk about. After that, we'll see what happens. I would definitely come back to the U.S. if the opportunity arose, and I would do more Revolutionary War battle and go back to my roots in the Colonial battle, because this is applicable to all time periods now.
Right.
It's not just any one time period or any one type of battle. So everything's up.
Now, Vic, in underwater archaeology in Massachusetts, can you tell us a little bit more about your work in your years as our underwater archaeologist?
Well, I mean, for me, it was basically trying to document the spectrum of the sort of the set of shipwrecks for the most part, though also early on pioneering the idea that there is preserved ancient Native American sites on the seafloor, and that those could be preserved. And we also, I mean, we can tell a lot about climate change stories by looking at that environment. People forget that even on Cape Cod, Billingsgate, which is a shoal, was an island, and people lived there. But I'm still interested in just anything. It's just trying to get people's interest, trying to show them that the maritime heritage is everyday heritage.
Right. There's one of the great things. It is and you do this in your article too, showing it's this mundane thing. The British Army needed to be fed, so they had these sheep and cattle out on Nautilus Island, and that's it's a fascinating battle, and I will recommend that people look up the article. And has there been anything else written or collected on the battle that would be of interest?
Well, Chris Mayo's work is documented. It is published. I don't have the references in front of me. I'm actually all three of us have tried to get material out there that focused
Yeah.
on specific aspects. Craig really focused on the history in the quarterly article. My article following that was focused on how to use the COCOA analysis. I think the failing of that military analysis is it doesn't really deal with the people that are
Yeah.
involved. It misses the point of leadership is critical, as well as the abilities of the people being led, and that's missing. We need to do more on this story with that. I mean, Stark is certainly a pivotal figure, but we explored it, but we didn't take it the full length of his story, or Nixon either.
Right. Well, we always find there are more stories to be told, and you guys really have found this one. I didn't want to say unearthed, since it is underwater, except of course for the parts that happened here on Novel's Island, or the fighting in what's now Revere or in Chelsea. I mean, it's a terrific story, and I want to thank you guys for joining us, and thank everyone for listening. It's amazing, since we started these podcasts a year or so ago, our audience has really expanded. So we have regular listeners in Haifa in Israel, and in Nottingham in England, as well as on Scarinish and Argyll and Boot in Scotland. So Craig has compatriots in Scotland who are listening in. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and listening, and everyone for being part of Revolution 250, and Craig Brown and Vic Mistone for their work in uncovering the Battle of Chelsea Creek. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.